at the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to start again. Just say that Elena Langdon is a Portuguese-English community and conference interpreter. She is also an interpreter trainer. She's certified by the American Translators Association and also as a core certified healthcare interpreter. She has an MA in Translation Studies from UMass Amherst. That was in fact when we first met. And she's been teaching interpreting and translation since 2005. Currently, she is teaching at UMass Amherst, at Langdon College, and also at UMass Medical School. She is on the board of the ATA, the American Translators Association, and has served on the boards of the New England Translators Association and the National Board of Certification for Medical Interpreters. For 6 years, Elena worked at a hospital in Western Massachusetts, supervising 50 staff interpreters. Since returning to freelance life, she has focused on conference interpreting and teaching. And last year, she helped form Seven Sisters Interpreter Training and Consulting, as well as String and Can Multilingual Online, which focuses on remote simultaneous interpreting. So the distinction between simultaneous and consecutive interpreting is also something that we'll be maybe hearing about a little bit tonight. Elena is launching a podcast about interpreting early this summer, and she joins us today from her home in Western Massachusetts, where she has lived for the past 17 years. She grew up on an island in southern Brazil. So Elena, it's such an honor, it's such a pleasure to have you speaking here tonight. I know there are many people in the audience who will be interested in hearing about your experiences. And I will now pass over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's an honor to be presenting today for you, for your class, and for some of my colleagues that I've invited and anyone else who's watching. Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit about this title. So, you know, what do I mean with this not quite magic title? It comes from the idea that, you know, I'm mostly working in simultaneous these days, and it can seem often impossible for outsiders to do such a thing. You know, I hear things sometimes like, I don't know how you can do it, or I could never do that. Even more hyperbolic things like, it's amazing what you do. You know, how does that happen? Lay people, if they can pay attention, if they're not fully engaged with the speech for some reason, are sometimes fascinated with what the interpreters are doing, and they're watching us. They're watching us render those words from one language into the other, and it's done pretty seamlessly. And I'm fascinated with that work too. And I'm fascinated with the people that I get to meet because of it and the places that I get to travel. I think that translation and now interpreting have, pardon the pun, but kind of put a spell on me. I'm not the type of person to stay with one thing. I tend to get bored easily. And yet I've been doing it for almost 20 years. And so that's where that title comes from. But today, really, the idea is to tell you a little bit about translation and interpreting and what it means to me. That's my focus. And then the value that they add to my life. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I do it, because even though it might seem like magic, it is something that can actually be taught. And so this is pretty much the summary of what I'm doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal story and kind of how it relates and how I see translation and interpreting connected to that. And then a little bit of pontificating about what translation means to me. Students in Carolyn's class and others who have studied translation or interpreting studies will know what I'm talking about. Practicing interpreters who aren't as aware of theory, it might come a little bit more as a surprise. And then I'm going to show a little bit of the work that I do as an interpreter with a lot of photos, and certainly remind me, if I don't talk about it, about some of the differences between community interpreting and conference interpreting, simultaneous and consecutive. I can talk about that as well.
Elena?
Yep.
Do you want us to do the poll at this point? Would this be a useful moment?
Yep, I think so, yeah.
Okay, all right. let's go in here. Oh, okay. I apologize that the poll we're going to launch, it's not the one that we re-edited. I don't know where that one has gone. Okay, there we go. So maybe you can do some clarifying in terms of, I wrote the poll, but Elena has things to say about it.
Yeah, so one of the things that Carolyn and I talked about right before was the difference between community interpreting and professional interpreting. And it used to be, and in some places it still is, community interpreting is seen as volunteer interpreting. But for the most part, most people see community interpreting as actually community interpreting where people are seeking services, public services. In Europe, it's called public service interpreting. So it's actually professional as well. And so I would say, you know, it's interesting just to see what people have answered. Community interpreting, when Carolyn set up the poll, was, I think people were thinking of it as volunteer interpreting that you might do for your family and friends. Whereas professional interpreting would be when someone pays you to do it and when you've been trained to do so. And so there's still a pretty good, fair mix there of people that don't have any experience interpreting. It looks like 75% of people have voted. We're getting close to 80%. And again, you know, this is just a poll to gauge you where you're at. So it's not that important if you've answered one way or the other. It does seem like a minority of you have done professional interpreting. Okay, I'll end that. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I can share the results, right? Yes, okay. So yeah, as we see, it's there's still a big half the viewers, I would say, haven't done any interpreting, which is interesting. Okay, do we want to do the next one?
Sure. Should we? All right.
Okay. And then we'll do the video where you can share your screen for that video.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let's go. I think poll 2. All right. There we go.
So this one's just about growing up, right? Not necessarily interpreting. Because so much of what I'm going to talk about has to do with my background and my life living between two different cultures. So it's a nice question just to see how many. And it looks pretty even again. Very interesting. And you know, you never know. It's hard to know who's on and who isn't, because you have about 40 students in the series. Is that right, Carolyn?
64.
Oh, okay. So the majority are your students then.
Yeah.
If not all of them. Yeah, I saw a few of my colleagues' names. But... And now we have somebody who wasn't muted. So if you haven't muted yourself and you're at home and you're perhaps making an order for French fries, you might want to mute yourself.
Right. Okay, so share the results of the poll there?
Sure. So the majority is from a monocultural background. Okay. So I was saying the reason that we're going to, the next video that we're going to share, the reason for doing it is because I was talking about how interpreting can definitely be taught, right? But it really cannot be taught to a machine. And I ran a little experiment that I want to share with you, and that's what Carolyn's going to share now.
Okay, all right, one sec. I'm just going to pull my screen up. So I'm going to end your screen sharing, and I'm going to pull up mine. There we go. All right, here we go. Oops, let me go back to the beginning.
Alguns dizem que a tradução é uma arte.
Some say that translation is an art.
Outros já acham que é uma questão mais
Sorry, that was me by mistake.
Técnica.
Others already think it is a more technical issue.
E de vez em quando as pessoas me perguntam se não é
People
mágica.
occasionally.
Me perguntam se não é mágica.
I am asked if it is not magic.
Não é bem mágica.
It's not quite magical.
Mas com certeza uma pessoa necessária.
But certainly a necessary person.
E essa pessoa é necessária porque uma máquina
person
não
needed?
consegue. Uma pessoa não consegue fazer um trabalho bom.
A person cannot do a good job.
Aliás, a pessoa pode. Quem não pode fazer um bom trabalho com tradução automática é a máquina.
That person who cannot do a good job with machine translation is the machine.
Como vocês estão vendo, porque a máquina não interpreta as coisas bem.
How do you see why the machine does not interpret things well?
A máquina especialmente não consegue lidar com perguntas, porque é muito difícil entender tom ou intenção.
Here's a good
The
one.
machine especially cannot handle questions because it is very difficult to understand Tom.
Tom é o nome do meu pai.
What's my father's name?
O que eu quis dizer é que a máquina não detecta intenção, porque intenção vem da
What I
voz.
meant is that the machine does not detect intention
Porque a intenção vem da voz.
because the intention comes from the voice.
Por que a intenção vem da voz?
Because the intention comes from the voice.
Isso foi uma pergunta.
Was that a question?
Was that a question? Good question.
Essa foi uma boa pergunta.
This was also a pretty good demo.
Essa também foi uma demonstração muito boa
Of a program that does not work pretty well.
de um programa que não funciona muito bem.
Alguns dizem que a tradução é uma arte.
Some say that translation is an art.
Outros já acham que é uma questão mais técnica.
Others already think it is a more technical issue.
E de vez em quando as pessoas me perguntam se não é
People
mágica.
occasionally.
Okay, do you want to just pause it there, Carolyn? I was muted myself. I just saw that.
I am asked if it is not.
Okay, all right, enough. Yes. Right.
So I thought that was kind of funny. I did it several times, and each time I did it to try to do a demo, I got different problems. But the main idea was that I was asking questions and answering and making statements because the word is the same in Portuguese for why and because it's the same word. And that's when some of the problems started happening. And then there was the funny time when I talked about tone, although I used the wrong term for tone in that sense, but I used the word tone, and then it interpreted it as Tom. And Tom is my father's name, and I said that, and then it said, what is my father's name? So it wasn't picking up on some of the words. And it's really about speech recognition, right? So that technology, which I just discovered, the only good thing about it, or the silver lining about it is that it actually is calling it an interpreter. And what you do is that this is on an Android, and so you tell your Android, I can't do it now because it'll pop up on my phone, but you say, okay, the name of the company, and then you say, be my Portuguese interpreter, or be my Spanish interpreter, and it'll do that for you. So it's a fun thing to do. That's the kind of fun I like to have. So anyway, no, the machines aren't taking over, and this is something that a lot of us talk about in all kinds of realms. It happened with translation, with written translation, and now there's a lot of debate about whether it's, the debate happened with written translation, and now the debate is happening about interpreting. And the answer is no, and I'll talk a little bit about that. As Carolyn mentioned, I grew up in between two countries. I moved to Brazil as a child, and I moved to this is a picture of the island. We moved there without any kind of connections. None of us knew Portuguese. I moved there with my mother and my brother, and we're pictured here. These are our passport photos.
We can't see you right now. At least I'm not seeing your, oh, okay, wait, I don't, can you just check the screen share? Because at the moment I've got, do you want just to, well, let's stop and restart again.
Sure.
The screen share. So I'll say, okay, wait a second.
What was it on?
It says, what are we doing here? It's kind of frozen on that one slide. So
that's happened with my students as well, and sometimes in Zoom, but it was only happening when I was sharing from Dropbox. So, okay, so I'll stop my share.
Okay.
Because it's basically not advancing the slides.
Right, right. Okay, so okay, so at the moment there's that.
So you have to, why don't you stop sharing your screen? That might be one of the issues. Okay.
Okay, there we go. All right, now try pulling yours up. Thank you everyone for bearing with us. There we go. Almost, yeah. Okay, good.
It's funny because this is the presentation that I've most scripted, and of course it's all it doesn't really matter because it hasn't started out with me being able to read the script, which is fine. But I usually wing it a lot more. So here you see, so now everyone hopefully can see the picture. This is a picture of Florianopolis, the island that I moved to when I was a child, and then you can see me and my brother and my mother, and it was the three of us who moved there with no connection to Brazil, not knowing any Portuguese, and just diving right in. And it was supposed to be a 2-year stint, and my mother still lives there. So it became a very long journey for her. And it was, for me, I was there throughout high school, and then I went back as an adult as well. And, you know, we didn't know what to expect when we got there. And it was just a really transformative experience in that sense. And a lot of what I feel as who I am today has to do with this, has to do with growing up there. Not only, but I grew up there, but I also grew up in the United States in the sense of I was here until I was 8 in the United States. And then I also would go back once a year. So I really grew up between the two countries. I grew up between the two languages, and you can see, if I can get this to work, there's a nicer image of the island. That's not just the photo, part of the island. So here you can see a photo of me in the United States, in New York, and me at around the same age in Florianopolis. So very different landscape, very different type of tree. And this was roughly the same time of the year because winter and summer are in, you know, take place at the same time across the two countries. And there's me slightly before we moved to Brazil. And there's me slightly after. There's me as a young teenager. And I like this photo. I wanted to show this photo despite the bad quality because it shows so much of what's iconic to Brazil for those of us that grow up there or that see it with fresh new eyes, which is the green of the vegetation. I mean, this was in a town. I didn't grow up in the jungle or anything like that. I grew up in a town, pretty developed town. It's the capital of the state. And I'm sitting on a veranda, which is very common in Brazil. And then here on the side, you can see the hammock, which is also very, very typical of Brazil, and the Venetian blinds as well. So I grew up between the two countries, and I grew up between the two languages. And for 11 months out of the year, I spoke Portuguese. And then for 1 month, I would speak English when I came back. I taught English to children as a teenager. The school was called Pink and Blue Freedom. And I revised my mother's articles that were in Portuguese because her Portuguese at that point still wasn't quite ready. And my Portuguese was fully developed as a teenager. And then later on as an adult, I did the opposite. I would revise a lot of her students' writing in English, and then I started translating it, even before I was a professional translator and really got into it. And the metaphor that I thought about for this, or when I thought about what I was doing in all these years between going back and forth and who I was, you know, speaking different languages in the two different countries, being with different people, with the exception of my brother, who was always with me in both places, and even being called a different thing, right? Because my name is a Spanish name. My parents did give me a Spanish name. They had both lived in Colombia for a long time before I was born. And so in Brazil, I was Elena. A few people thought my name was Elling or Ellen and would call me Elling, but my name was Elena in Brazil, and it was Elena in the United States. So it was the same thing, but it wasn't quite the same. Similar to these photos of before and after. So these were taken only a few months later. And the one on the left is right before I went to Brazil. This was the time that people did perms, even children, because I do not have curly hair. That's a home perm. And a few months later when I was in Brazil. So it's the same person, but it's not quite. And I feel like the photo is a nice reflection of some of the differences. Of course, I've also aged a little bit. My hair has grown a little bit, but the time span is actually not that big. And again, thinking about this, you know, I was Elena and Elena. I was the same and I wasn't quite the same, which is similar to what Umberto Eco said about translation being not quite the same thing, right? Not quite magic, not being quite the same thing, although he does it, he does not do it in the negative. He says it's dizer quase a mesma coisa in Portuguese, which is saying almost the same thing. And I feel that for me, my identity was always like that as well. During these years where I was shifting in back and forth, I was the same, but I really wasn't quite the same. So interesting, and I think it makes sense that I've been doing translating and interpreting for so long, because given that experience, it resonates with me at a very deep level because of that. Now, today I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about myself and that identity, and then talk about interpreting, about saying almost the same thing, and also about these new worlds that open up when I transit between the two worlds, just like I transited between the United States and Brazil as a child. When I feel like I transport myself and I transport others to meanings that were never imagined before. And I'm going to talk about how making that connection between people, it not only keeps me going, but it actually grounds me. And so all these years, one thing that has been constant has been translation and interpreting. Living in between the cultures and families can feel chaotic for a lot of people. I have a lot of friends who did similar things, and for them it was much more conflicted, and they have not so joyous feelings about living in between countries. They had also a very different experience, as we all do, and some of them moved more. I had the advantage of going to a very, very different place and staying in that same town. But for me, translation has really provided a home in that in-between, you know, in the world where neither country or language lies. And when I stop, it feels like a very peaceful place. It feels like a very still place to be there. I don't know how familiar you might be with the Chronicles of Narnia, but I recently started reading the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, which is The Magician's Nephew, and I started reading it to my 7-year-old. And in the very beginning, they talk about this image, which as soon as I read about it, my mind just almost exploded in the sense of when I was thinking about what it means to me. And so in this book, these children discover that if they put on rings, and there's 2 colored rings, coincidentally, they're green and yellow, which are the national colors in Brazil. This book is not Brazilian. If they put on a different ring, they can be transported to a different world. In between that, in between going from one universe to another, there is this wood between the worlds. That's the name of the chapter that talks about this specifically. And these children put on the ring, and then suddenly they're in these woods. And it's a beautiful, very peaceful, calm woods. Nothing is happening. And in fact, nothing happens. They observe that. But there are multiple ponds, and they realize that if they go into a pond with a different colored ring, they will be transiting into a different world, a different universe. And I really love this image. And to me, it feels very similar to that, going in between. And I think translation and interpreting can be a metaphor that works with that as well. I think the craft of translating back and forth transport me to other worlds, and they become the rings. So my languages and translation are my rings. But then it's not just me who gets transported, right? It's the people that I'm working for. I get to transport other people as well. I'm making the connections between them, and I'm bringing them from one world into another. And I know this sounds very romantic, but I think it's a beautiful image of thinking of how we can connect people together and really bringing different worlds in contact. When I was in college, I majored in journalism, and I did it at first because I wanted to write, and then I started. I wanted to be in public radio, and I imagined that what I would be doing would be telling people's stories. But I wouldn't just be telling people's stories. I would be listening to their stories, and I would be bringing it to a wider public, right? Which is what good journalism does. You listen to people's stories, and then you bring them to other people. And I'm doing that. I'm not doing it as a journalist. I'm doing it as an interpreter. I can listen to people's stories and then transform it into something else so that others can hear that story. Now, as I said, some of you might be more familiar with this concept of transforming it into something else, as translation as transformation, or translation as change, or not quite the same thing, or almost the same thing. Not everyone is comfortable with that. Of course, when we work as an interpreter, and when we're trained as interpreters, and when I train students to be interpreters, it's not in the field of comparative literature, and we focus on the standards of practice. And of course, what is the number one thing that we focus on? It's accuracy, right? Of course, the message that someone gives in English is going to be interpreted or translated into roughly the same message into Portuguese. That's the goal. But theorists recognize that it's not possible, that it can't be the same thing, because people have different backgrounds, people have different worlds. And so you simply cannot bring the world exactly the same from one place into another. You bring yourself and you bring your background into language, but you don't bring the entire world. And it's not possible for any interpreter to bring the exact same message necessarily. Of course, the message is always honored. The message is always what we are taking and trying our best and working really hard to convert it into almost the same thing. But we are transforming that story to a certain extent. There's our filter to begin with. So of course, the basic theory of communication being that you have an intent and you put it out, and it might not be interpreted, it might not be understood the right way or the way you intend it by your listener, depending on a series of things. But when we express ourselves, we can never be sure that the other person is understanding us, right? This is kind of basic communication theory. And so when you have an interpreter in the mix, when you have a translator, it gets even more complex. It gets even more complicated. And that's simply what I'm trying to talk about here, is just the complexity behind it, and the fact that I have a filter. So I listen to what someone said as an interpreter. I understand it. I do my best to make sure that I'm understanding fully what they're saying. Depending on the setting, I get to ask questions, but I can't as a conference interpreter for the most part. And then I convert that message as best I can for my other audience. You know, we saw this with that Google's interpreter function, right? The machine can't be trained for this type of thing. The machine can't be trained for understanding all the nuances of languages. There was at one point that you saw in the example where I said a person is necessary, but I said the word is so quickly that Google didn't pick it up in its speech recognition. And so it being a machine, it changed the sentence completely. A person listening to me wouldn't have done that, wouldn't have made that mistake, because it was obvious in terms of what I was saying. The context was there, right? The history of what I had been saying, the history of who I was there. Somebody listening to me, Elena, would have known that I was saying a person is necessary. Not, you know, we can't do just with machines. The machine can't know that. Similarly with mishearing any kind of word, you know, if a person says, I like the color bread, humans aren't going to hear I like the color, or I like the color red. They're not going to hear I like the color bread. A machine possibly could, although the machine could be trained to associate red with bed, with colors rather, and not with bread. I'm getting this all confused, aren't I? Because I'm trying to go off my script. But at any rate, I think you get my point, which is the machine is given a variety of algorithms. It's given a variety of input, rather, not algorithms. It puts this together, but it can't account for context. It can't account for that human interpretation, which is necessary, the human understanding of context and where this person is coming from and background. And I think, and that's one reason that I think that we're not going to be taken over by machines. We have to use them more and more, and that's actually a good thing. I used to tell my students all the time, you know, yes, if you run into problems with your terminology, you can consult a dictionary. You know, back in the days when I carried a paper dictionary in my purse when I went to the hospital to work as a medical interpreter. It was mostly there for psychological support, but I had it in my purse. I said, you're not expected to be a walking dictionary. It's okay to not know a term. Of course, now we have almost walking dictionaries in our pockets because of phones, and that's a good thing. They can aid us, they can help us. It's not about that. We want to make good use of the technology, and I think that the interpreters that do are much better off. But it won't replace us. It really won't. Another reason, or not another reason, connected to this idea of context is preparation, because many interpreters get jobs in a variety of settings and a variety of topics. And we're not walking dictionaries, and we're also not walking encyclopedias. We don't know everything about everything. And so preparation is really key. This is one of the things, yeah, my Mac likes to do this every once in a while. Not sure what you're seeing. There we go. Okay, you are seeing the right thing again. Let me know, Carolyn, if something isn't right. It should be now shifting to a new picture, which is an image for preparation. So preparation is a key thing for interpreters. And this is for those of you who don't work as an interpreters, but who want to, or who are wondering, how do we do this? A big part of it is preparing ahead of time so that we know the context, so that we know what to expect, so that we can predict more or less what the speaker will say. As I was saying in the example before, so that we can predict that me, a professional interpreter, am going to say in this moment in time that a machine cannot replace us, that a person is necessary, and not whatever Google Translate thought that I was trying to say. And so we do all kinds of studying to prepare for an assignment. This is also so that we can so that we can better understand the context and be able to predict what somebody's saying. It's also very important so that we can take our effort, our cognitive effort, and place it where it's needed the most. And so if we're trying to understand a concept or trying to understand a speaker, we're simply not going to have enough brain power, enough cognitive power to do everything else that we have to do when we're interpreting. Part of it's that we also take notes, and we rely on our booth mate if we're in a booth for memory, to aid our memory. And again, we study a lot of ahead of time because of that. There's Daniel Giu is one of the theorists that's used a lot in the field of interpreting. And he has a chapter in one of his books that talks about the effort model of interpreting. And that's the basic idea behind it, is that there's only so much that we can do cognitively speaking in our brains when we're processing language and meaning and, you know, receiving the message and decoding it and then encoding it again into the other language. There's only so much we can do. And so part of easing that load, that cognitive load, is to do a lot of preparation ahead of time. And so that's part of how that magic, or almost magic, happens for us. This image is here just to another story in my life that reminded me kind of my work as an interpreter was when I was in college. I had the opportunity to work as a prop assistant in the opera at Indiana University, where I did my undergraduate degree, and they had a very good opera school. Amazing performers. And I just made props, and I didn't even do a very good job. I barely knew how to use the glue gun. It was a student job. It's a perfect thing. I got paid whatever it was at the time, $5 probably an hour, and I kind of made props, and the prop manager did most of the work. But I helped, and I put things together, and I would get to sit in the audience when they were doing the full rehearsals. They would let us do it one night when the other team was doing the props part of the rehearsal, and watch the magic of opera come together, and watch this beauty, and feel like I was part of it. I was contributing to that without having any talent as an opera singer, without any talent as a classic musician, or even any very much talent as a prop maker. But I was part of it, and I was aiding in it, and I was helping to make it happen, which I think is another nice idea when you think about translation and interpreting. I'm helping the connection happen. I'm helping communication. In fact, the big difference is that without an interpreter, it won't happen. Without the prop maker in opera, it will happen. But without an interpreter, it won't. And so we are even more vital than that. But it's just really nice to be often part of something really beautiful, and something essential, vital, something that's a matter of life or death in the cases of medical interpreters and sometimes court interpreters. And then conference interpreters, which have a big variety of things. And that's the next thing that I'm going to show you, is kind of a lot of the variety of the work that I get to do. So I'm going to move out of this pontificating. I'm sure you've had enough of it by now. And I'm going to show you some pictures of the really neat work that I get to do, and talk a little bit about the setup and a little bit of the technical parts of it, or just how we do it, how we make that magic happen. One thing I wanted to mention as I start is that as an interpreter, for me, the best thing, the biggest reward is when when someone tells a joke in English and the Portuguese speakers laugh after I've rendered that joke successfully into Portuguese or vice versa. For some reason, seeing and hearing the laughter in the audience and knowing that it was because I was able to transmit that message is a really big reward. And some of my work is quite the opposite, is very heavy work and very sad work, and it's nice to have that the lightness of it, when you can help people connect that way, and an audience is connected to their speaker even though their speaker doesn't speak the same language. So here is a typical conference interpreting setup. More and more common, unfortunately, because this is what we call a half booth. Conference interpreters, booth interpreters really don't like these, because as you can see, the interpreter is sitting outside of the booth. So it's really just an illusion that there's any kind of acoustic protection for their voices. The active interpreter here, because it's not me taking the picture, is leaning in. And part of that is because he needs to see the PowerPoint that's in front of him, but it's through a smaller glass window or plastic window, and also because he's trying to not be so loud for the people that are in the room that are in front of us. This is a dual language setup. So these are the French interpreters, I believe, or perhaps they were Spanish interpreters, and here are the Portuguese interpreters. For those of you that have never worked in interpreting, for this type of setup, we always work in pairs. And we work for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we rest for 20 to 30 minutes while we help our booth mate. And so it's not all about taking selfies, no. We actually will listen to what's being said, we'll listen to our booth mate and help them and pass notes. That's what this piece of paper is here. In front of the console. And I'm still looking at my terminology. I'm still picking up things and making any notes. And then if the booth mates needs help, I'm there for that as well. Here is a photo from inside the booth. This is a different event. And so this is what it looks like. This is the smaller window I was telling you about. This is a pretty typical console for simultaneous interpreting in the booth. This is a more informal setup. This was done at this point with, well, it's like a tour guide system. So the interpreter's here in the corner and she's got a headset on, and people listening have headsets on as well. She's got a mic that's being transmitted by FM or a different signal. And so she can hear, but it's only one way. So, and it's similar to a booth setting. No, that's not right. It's not one way in a booth setting, sorry. This is not one way. This is one way because if she were to speak, the interpreter has to go close to her because she can't hear her in the headset. So it's a one-way system. Whoops, and I'm going the wrong way. This is another small meeting setup. Here you can see the equipment on the table that's being used. The interpreters we were probably in a half booth in this setting, although we might not have been because it's a tour guide. Sometimes they're used together. This is a bigger room, right? And this was a particularly terrible job for the interpreter because this was also done with a tour guide system. And so we had to listen to the sound that was in this huge cathedral ceiling room, and it was quite difficult. We were at the back of the room trying to listen to the speaker and then speak very low into our microphone. This was a much bigger event, thousands of people at the Boston Convention Center, but we had the same problem. We were not given a booth for this particular room. They pulled us at the last minute. And so you see here an interpreter sitting at a table, and you can see here the woman in yellow who is covering her ear. She's covering her ear because she can hear the interpreter, because the interpreter doesn't have a booth. And the interpreter's listening to the sound over the loudspeakers like everyone else. This is a terrible setup. And this is really taxing. This is particularly hard to do. This this is not usually when we get praised for our good work, because it's extremely difficult to do well. And here, illustrating the lack of booth in a different setup where they have the interpreter in front, is my good colleague Steve Sanford, who is at the front here, and he is shielding his face with a piece of paper, because again, look how close the audience members are to him. So he's listening to the speaker, also just speaking out loud and using the tour guide system to interpret one way to the entire audience. This was a situation that really would have benefited from a two-way system and from a booth, but it didn't, and so this is what we do. We sometimes put paper in front of our faces, basically so the sound doesn't project as far. This is well before, well, I don't even want to mention it, but it's well before COVID-19. And this is another setting where it's a small business meeting, and I was in the room, and I was using a tour guide system and listening to the speaker. It's a much smaller room though, but I also have to shield my voice. This would not be with a booth setup. So there's all these different kinds of setups that you can see even within this basic idea of business interpreting, right? This is all simultaneous, and I'm going to mention that now because I said I would. Simultaneous, for those of you who don't work in interpreting, is when you're speaking at relatively the same time as the other speaker. So the interpreter is speaking along with the speaker, but just in a different language. We are trailing behind a little bit because we have to get the full meaning of the utterance beforehand. So we can't just start with the first word and translate the first word. We have to wait until we get kind of a subject, verb, and an object, and then we'll start going. And that lag time will vary a little bit, but in general, it's pretty simultaneous. Consecutive is when a person speaks, stops, and then the interpreter speaks and translates, and then stops, and then the other person might speak. Tends to be in a dialogue setting, although not always. Sometimes it's used for presentations, as we'll see in some of these photos. Now, often I interpret for things that I have no interest in and that I find pretty gross. This was a conference on something that I learned about when I studied for it, which is called aesthetic medicine. And it's basically non-surgical interventions for the supposed enhancement of supposed beauty, with this before and after picture here. And so they insert threads into your face to lift up things like cheekbones and eyebrows. Something that I have no interest in. And I don't get much joy of interpreting that in the sense of bringing people together and connecting them. But I do in a lot of the other work that I get to do. This was an event that I did with Davi Kopenawa, who's another indigenous activist. In addition to Sonia Guajajara, he's in a totally different part of Brazil. Not totally different, but he's in a different part of the Amazon. And he came to Harvard a year or two ago, and I was able to be his interpreter, and it was amazing. And I don't have a good picture for it, but he spoke in, I believe it's Guarani that he speaks, and he spoke in Guarani at points and had his own interpreter, and I took relay from that interpreter who was speaking Portuguese. And so I took it from Portuguese into English, which is another thing that we get to do. And that was really, really neat to see. And it was a real honor to be able to interpret for him and his message about the Amazon. And this was before all the latest really big fires that were in the Amazon. This is another event at Harvard that was a real amazing treat to interpret. And it was all about terreiros in Brazil, which was translated by the program as sacred groves, and Afro-Brazilian religion. There were some Afro-Brazilian religious leaders that came. There were people from Kenya that came, and then there were these famous Harvard scholars in the room. So it was a really nice thing to be able to do. And here you see my computer. This is the speech that we received ahead of time. So some of the talks were scripted, and so we had it in English, and so we were following what they were saying, reading what they had written in English, and then saying it into Portuguese, which is quite complex as well. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I think we're getting to the end here. Here is Sonia Guajajara and Célia Chacriabá. who came to Smith College, like as Carolyn said, about, I don't even know anymore. The concept of time is all gone. No, it was about 2 months ago. Here is my colleague, Jacob Avazian, who was taking notes and interpreting at this dinner. We were taking turns because that happens too. The interpreter has to interpret during meals sometimes. This was consecutive interpreting without any kind of equipment. Here I am with them. Here is a very different setting, and I'm going to go through these photos pretty quickly, but this was a really neat event that I got to do that was with Brazilians training on how to defend nuclear power plants. And they came to the United States and trained with former military and other security specialists on how to use guns and how to protect their nuclear power plants. These were academics and managers. They were not people who would necessarily had any familiarity with guns. So it was really interesting. It was all consecutive. So you see there's no equipment being used here, and there I am in the middle interpreting what has already been said by the gentleman on my right. Here we are out in the field. I'm also interpreting. See, I'm using my hands, which is a common sight. Here I am in the back with the colorful scarf while they're learning to do target practice. This is a very interesting job. This job, there were 4 interpreters. I was invited by a very good colleague of mine, Linnea Hansen, who hired and organized us interpreters, and we were in 4 because it was such a demanding job. 2 weeks long, all consecutive, and we've got to mute another mic there. Anyway, so this is showing. In this case, I don't have interpreting equipment. This was, you can see the microphone there. That was just to amplify the sound. They tried that out because it was such an open space. And then there were classes too that were part of it. So then we were up in front of the class, also doing consecutive. So this is when it was basically one-way information, but we were doing it consecutive because they did not want to use any equipment. Here we are in the field again. I like this one because you can see how much communication takes place with the hands. Both the interpreter and the speaker are using their hands in this one, and then everyone else is listening. Some looking at me, some looking at him. And here you see the same thing. The interpreter speaking to, this is my colleague Tom Norton, speaking to the Brazilian and the English speakers on the left. And I like this photo because in this photo, it shows other things that interpreters sometimes have to do, which includes running. So part of the training was to learn how to run and defend the nuclear power plant. And so Tom is here running in the far right of the screen while the Brazilian manager is running with his gun. And we were wearing orange vests so that we wouldn't be hit by it was laser and forgetting the terms. I studied this 2 years ago and I don't remember anymore the other thing they were using, but it apparently would hurt if we ever got hit. That's why we're wearing the orange vests. Very quickly now, and I've been doing this work for at least a year, very focused on changing the type of work that I do and adding something new to it. And now, of course, I and all the other interpreters have been practically forced to confront the fact that if we don't change, at least temporarily, the way we're delivering our services as interpreters, we're not going to have any work. And I'm talking about, again, COVID-19. There are no conferences in person taking place. And so a lot of us lost a lot of work and there's simply nothing going on in that regard face-to-face. Medical interpreters have lost a lot of work as well because a lot of medical appointments are not taking place, but then there's also a lot of work attending those in urgent need at hospitals who have the virus or something else that's urgent going on. So what is this new thing that I've added? It's called, by most people, remote interpreting. And what it is it allows for the interpreter to not be on site. It, of course, as you just saw through that variety of photos, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to show you such a variety of settings. It doesn't work in all the settings, but in some of them it could. And this would be the console of one of the many platforms that exist for remote interpreting of the interpreter. And so I can mute my mic, as you see. I can see the levels. I can control the outgoing and the incoming channels, right? So the speaker and myself, I can control those volumes. Each platform has advantages and slight disadvantages to it. But this is a really nice view. And so this shows that the interpreter can see the people having the meeting. The people don't see the interpreter, but they're going to hear the interpreter. This is a stock photo, so they're not wearing anything, but they would all be looking at their devices and using probably headphones. A speakerphone in general is not recommended for listening. That's certainly not recommended to pick up people speaking or multiple speaking in a meeting room. This is a screenshot of another platform. These are events that would have taken place. Some of them are for my students. And this is a shot on the left of what the controls, some of the controls look like for the interpreter. So again, how to pass off to your booth mate, all of these things are built into the platform because usually you would be sitting next to your booth mate if you're doing this. And this is what we call remote simultaneous interpreting. There's remote interpreting over the phone, and there's remote interpreting by video, which is mostly what we see in hospitals and some courts. And that's a lot simpler to a certain extent, and it's a lot more difficult because if you don't see the person, it's even more difficult and you don't know what to expect at all. And it's a lot less costly for the client because this type of platform for remote simultaneous interpreting has to have very secure servers, very good internet connection on behalf of everyone, and dedicated technical staff, and a series of other things as well. Not to mention the trained interpreter. This is not what no one sees me in remote simultaneous, but that's just my setup, a little bit different from this silly green screen that you see behind me today. With that, I think we're going to open up to questions or breakout rooms, however you have that organized, Carolyn. But I want to thank you for listening to me this far, and I hope that I made some sense connecting kind of how my background growing up, my connection to 2 countries, to 2 languages, and then this wonderful work that I get to do that really, as I said, grounds me and keeps me going at it and keeps me feeling very, very happy to be doing what I do. And I feel a lot of gratitude when I think about all that I'm able to do because of that. And I learned, quote, the easy way. I was one of those lucky people who did not have to study as an adult another language or another culture. So thank you.
Apologies for that delay. Thank you so much, Elena. That was a fantastic presentation of the multifaceted life of an interpreter. I think it would be nice if there were people who have questions. I have now, you can unmute yourselves and you can put your hand up, I believe, in the participants. So if there's anybody who would like to ask a question to Elena, oh, and I can see some nice claps there, but I'm gonna look through and if there's anybody who would like to ask a question at this point.
I saw Ellie. Did you see Ellie raised her hand? Ellie, I think it was Lipson.
Sorry. Sorry, we have a long list of people here. So yes, Ellie, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm not Ellie, but it's fine. It's fine. But I have a question. This is more relating to like your personal life that you're talking about at the beginning. Like, this is not really related to translation or interpreting, but I wonder if you consider yourself like a third culture kid, because this is something I think that was brought up maybe in earlier lectures, but it's kind of a question.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, because first it shows that it wasn't completely ridiculous that I was addressing those personal things. Yeah, and that was actually something that in the beginning I had it in my notes to incorporate the third culture kid idea, but but I didn't. Yes, and it's something I learned about maybe 5 years ago. Somebody came to the New England Translators Association and talked a little bit about himself as a third culture kid, and then I did some more research. For those of you who don't know it, it's basically children who are raised in a country that's not their parents' homeland. So when you're raised in one or multiple countries that your parents don't have a connection to before they go there. And there's a whole culture around that. And the idea being this third culture kid because you create or your culture, your background is composed of a third thing, right? It's not the, in my case, it was just two countries. So it's not just the United States and Brazil. It's not like, am I American? Am I Brazilian? Which was a question for me for so long in my life. But rather it's a third thing. It's the mix. It's having been raised by, in my case, an American in Brazil, and knowing that those are the two main influences, right? My parent and then the world around me. So thank you, Elle, for that question.
I think what I'd like to do now, actually, is to give everybody a little bit of time to process and talk this through. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put us into breakout rooms for 5 minutes or so, something like that. I am aware of the time, and it's the end of a long day. I know a lot of people have had several Zoom classes. If you have a specific question, though, for Elena and would like to, you can refuse to join the room and perhaps stay in the main meeting room. And then ask Elena questions right in here. Otherwise, if you want to go into a breakout room and really talk about your own experiences and how they may connect to some of the ideas that Elena was presenting here. So I'm going to create those rooms right now. There we go. And as I said, feel free to not to join if you want to stay here and ask questions. Okay, so if you are still in this main room and have questions for Elena, you could simply unmute your mic and fire away. Ilse, I see that you're here. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I actually had a question because I'm personally really interested in going into interpreting eventually. And I wondered if you had any advice.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I'd have to know a little bit more about what, what your background already is. I can, let's see, in a nutshell, in a minute or so. I mean, you have to have the two languages or more that you work with need to be very strong. So that's the first thing. Now that you're saying I'm thinking about it, I would get both of them very strong because we all have different experiences. Some people, might have, you might have come to the United States when you were a teenager. And so in that case, sometimes people have both languages or have weaknesses. So you want to make sure that both of them are very strong if you want to work as an interpreter in a dialogue setting or a bidirectional setting, which in the United States is the majority. In Europe, it's more common to have people going from 3 languages into 1. And so they have what they call B or C languages or passive languages in which they don't actually ever speak as an interpreter. In the United States, we don't see that very much. In the United States, you're really expected to do both. And of course, one is going to be stronger than the other, but you want to try to make them both as strong as possible. So read, write, speak, and listen as much as possible in both languages of the similar things. So a newscast in both languages, books, podcasts are a great way, and then practice, of course, your speaking, and you're listening to someone else. And then there's nowadays. To become an interpreter, it's no longer the case that it was even for me, which was not that long ago, 17 years ago when I came to the United States and started working as a medical interpreter with no training at all. I was doing my master's in translation studies, but I hadn't even started the master's. I had no training as an interpreter, and I stepped right into not only a hospital, but a psychiatric locked unit hospital. And you can't really do that anymore, at least not in Massachusetts. And I would urge you not to do that. It's not a good way to start. So I would say to look for specialized training. There's very good pragmatic practice-based training if that's what you want to do. If you want to study it more, then you would go more the route of translation studies. Interpreting studies doesn't exist that much in the United States. And even translation studies is not that much either. Programs in the United States are, for the most part, not degree granting unless you work with Spanish. Then there are a couple of them spread across the country that are undergraduate. And there are, I want to say, 2 or 3 that are graduate programs. Yes, Kent State, Monterey, and Maryland, University of Maryland, I believe, have graduate degrees as translators or interpreters, but some of them are language specific. And then Glendon College, where I teach, which is based in Toronto, has a very interesting program where it's a master's in conference interpreting. And the first year is all online. And then the second year, and that's the one I teach in, and then the second year is in Toronto. So it's a nice option for to get a master's. It's really specialized. It's conference interpreting. It's language specific. You have 6 classes a semester, and 3 of them are in your language only. For the first year, that is. Let's see. Yeah, I think in a nutshell, that would be, seek training. There's a lot of workshops. Join a professional association. That's also another good piece of advice that I give. The New England Translators Association, if you're at the 5 colleges, it's $50 a year to join. I think if you're a student, it might be even less. And it's a really good way to start to meet other people that work as translators and interpreters, to see what they do, to perhaps find an informal mentor, to start making connections. There are other students that are in these associations. And then after that, there are also specialized associations. So there's some for legal interpreters, there's some for medical interpreters. There's an association for conference interpreters, but it's a little bit different. It's not the same thing, and it's very exclusive. You don't really get into it until you've had a lot of experience. So it's not for beginners. But that's a really good way to do it. And that's what I did when I first moved back. I almost immediately joined NATA, the New England Translators Association, and it opened up a whole new world. I had been working as a translator for 3 years in Brazil, completely isolated from the professional community other than my boss, who was the sworn translator of the state, and very good at what she did. But I had no network outside of that. And so that was the only world I knew. And it just opened up a whole new world right away.
That's wonderful to have that practical advice. Thank you, Elena. I think I'm gonna, actually I noticed that a lot of people stayed in the room. So obviously maybe there are more questions. I'm gonna close up the breakout rooms and have those people join us back here. Is there anybody else with other questions that you wanted to ask Elena?
Look like Lisette has her hand raised.
Yes, go ahead.
His hand. Yeah.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hello, I'm from Peru. I'm a professional interpreter. And actually I just landed in this conference, which is very good. I love to hear from your experience. And I am an interpreter trainer at the moment at a university. And I wanted to know what platform do you recommend for teaching simultaneous interpretation? Or if maybe you have a preference for some platform, because right now with this COVID situation, we needed to change the way we teach our students. And that's something that I was interested.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad you're here. So I've been teaching online simultaneous interpreting for a while, but without RSI, or remote simultaneous interpreting platforms. So a workaround that I was already using, because it was built into Blackboard, which was the learning management system that we used, was VoiceThread. And VoiceThread is a way to share videos for students to create video or create audio and then comment on each other's audio or video file. So it's a really nice way for feedback, for discussions, and even for interpreting as well, because you can do some interpreting that way. It's a workaround in that you would have them play the speech on one device, right, and they're listening to it and then simultaneously interpreting it while VoiceThread is recording it. And it makes it easier because VoiceThread does not, it's a much smaller file. It's all within the program, because creating videos are very big files. They're hard to share. I'm sure that's what you're finding. It's one of the difficulties. I've heard of, I want to say it's Go React, which I believe is a platform that's sounds very similar to VoiceThread, that teachers in Europe are using, and I think Barry Olson from the Monterey Institute is using it as well. So look at Go React. And then the platform that I've taught it on, where it's specifically remote simultaneous, is VoiceBoxer, which is the RSI platform. And they do have educational licenses, which are affordable. Kudo, I think they're giving away free educational licenses. And that would always, so those two platforms, VoiceBoxer and Kudo, would be very good for training, like the whole thing. That's not a workaround at all. And then they not only would they be trained as simultaneous interpreters, but they'd be trained as remote simultaneous, which would actually be a really nice thing to add. And the last thing I'm going to say on that, Lizette, is if you're on Facebook, there's a very good group of teachers and instructors from around the world that are trying to figure out how to teach simultaneous and consecutive interpreting online. So I believe it's something like Instructors Blundering Through Online Teaching during a pandemic. That's the title. If you Google those things, you'll probably find it. And the woman who runs it is Sophie, with a Phie, Llewellyn, LLE. And I'm not going to be able to spell that in my head, but Llewellyn with 2 L's at the beginning, Smith. And if you look for her on Facebook or Twitter too, there's a lot of conversations on Twitter about that. But thank you. That's a great question.
Yes, so wonderful to have you with us from Peru, Lisette. I'm delighted that you joined our class this evening and our gathering. Is there anybody else? I'll just open up for a last question if there's anybody else. And I know after that, probably you are all ready to leave your computer screens, I imagine. Okay, all right. I think we'll end it there with, I think at the bottom of our screens, we do have reactions. So I'd like to say thank you, Elena. That's my clapping. And thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and your ideas and thoughts with us. That was really fantastic. Good night, everyone. I look forward to seeing you next week for our concentrators presentations. And thank you to all of the guests who joined us in this lecture tonight.
Yes. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, everyone.